All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's just about 4 p.m. Eastern here in North Carolina. My name is Megan with Aperture Education. Thank you so much for joining us for the second part of our Trauma-Informed Practices mini-series. If you've joined us last time, you'll remember some of the things that I'm just about to share with you. And if you've never joined us on a webinar before, there are a few things that I would like to point out before we begin. You should see at the bottom of your screen a couple of options, one of them being a chat feature. If you'd like to use the chat feature to introduce yourself, you can share your name, your school district, your job title, where you're from, just so we can kind of get an understanding of who's with us today, and perhaps you can look and see if there are any people that are in your neck of the woods that are joining us. We also have a feature called Q&A. If at any point during the presentation you have questions for the presenters, you can put your questions in the Q&A boxes and we will make sure that they answer those questions either during the webinar or as a follow-up. Also, you'll see that there is a feature for you to raise your hand. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can raise your hand and someone from our team will reach out to you via a private chat to make sure that everything is going all right for you. Sometimes some people can't see the slide deck, or sometimes the audio will kind of get a little fuzzy. So if you have any issues with that, you can raise your hand and we will answer you through a private chat. Just a few more things. We will be sending out a recording of the webinar, most likely tomorrow morning, just because the recording probably won't be ready until then. In that email, you will also get a link to request a certificate of participation. It's just a really short form that you can fill out, and it will automatically generate a certificate for you for this specific mini-series. Let's see, is there anything else that I am missing? I don't think so. Once again, the chat feature, you feel free to chat with us during the presentation. The Q&A is for any questions that you have for the presenters. And one last thing, if you are seeing the slides, you should be seeing in the middle of your screen a slide deck that says Aperture Education at the top, and then Welcome Trauma-Informed Practices mini-series. If for whatever reason that is not showing up for you in the middle of your screen, it may be showing up at the top of your screen in a smaller box. And what you'll want to do is just double click on that, and then it should open it up into the larger box. But once again, if you have any questions about technical issues, you can raise your hand. So with that, I am going to go ahead and pass it over to our presenters, Brian and Lisa Ann.
Great. Well, thank you, Megan. Always a pleasure. I have to admit, I was getting drawn into all the people who are on this webinar. My name is Brian Clement. I am the Director of Programs and Partnerships at Dovetail Learning, where we believe in a world of kind, connected human beings. Come to this work by way of teaching and being a principal, and then county level positions in and specifically around trauma. Excited to be talking about the other side of the equation and putting into context that our previous webinar was definitely about the traumas, defining and understanding. And excited to be working with Lisa Ann. Lisa Ann.
Thanks, Brian. Hi, my name is Lisa Ann Williams, and I've been with Aperture now for the past 3 years after transitioning out of the classroom from about 13 years of experience across the 3 states. I'm really excited to be able to get my head a little bit more into thinking about what this really looks like in the classroom. It's quite easy to remember some of the more eventful things as a teacher, but it is also very helpful to be grounded in the experiences that our educators are dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and thinking about what trauma looks like in the classroom from their perspective, while still trying to support other needs of districts and educators. So I'm gonna pass it back off to Brian, and I'll continue to monitor questions as well, and take it away.
Fantastic. So, context is everything. Coming into the second webinar, I'm super appreciative of the ability to talk about what we can do and what is in our control. It's a unique experience to present in a webinar sort of segments of a larger conversation. And when I do my in-person trainings, I'm aware of how many threads we follow based on what's in the room and what's relevant. And as I took a cursory glance of everyone who's showing up in the room, there's so many different members of this audience. I encourage any and all follow-up that you might have in your specific arena that you need clarification or support with. Part of why when I do my trainings with teachers about social and emotional learning programs and kind of consulting around that, really kind of lands us in that summative statement there. Children have impeccable reasons for behaving exactly as they do, right? We need to understand these contexts and these conditions so that we can then move into that second quote, which really represents this message of hope. And I have to admit, I want to kind of clean up or address some things that were brought up in the last webinar. I'm totally into this podcast Experts on Experts, and they do this sort of fact check dimension to it. And not so much a fact check, but I wanted to expand or clarify one answer because I was listening to my own responses to a question about military. And when I actually heard it at first, I want to make sure that we understand when the question was asked about military and departure and deployments and the effect on the child, the question was, could deployment or separation be counted as an ACE? And I think I said yes, but that was yes to the answer, could it be? And I want to make sure I clarify that deployment or people who are service providers, it is not inherently an ACE, and I go on to kind of complicate the why, but I just want to make sure that's heard and clarified. It is not inherently an ACE or trauma. And then also, I thought it was totally relevant and appreciate a follow-up to a question around 9/11. And I used a term multiple generations. In that one incident, multiple generations were affected. We can picture support systems at even any one school that were in the umbrella of impact. Multiple generations versus the distinction of multi-generational transmission of trauma, which is something I was talking about when we were talking about initiatives out here in California to disrupt that. So multi-generational transmission of trauma is when we pass on practices, substance abuse to the next generation. For instance, as my father was, the discipline system of my grandfather was to use a belt. My dad disrupted that system by not then doing that for me. So my children, my grandchildren, or his grandchildren benefit from his wonderful choices, which brings me full circle back to this choice about working together. We can heal ourselves and generations to come. And it's really the side of the resilience, right? There's two parts of this equation: understanding what is and where we come from through that lens of ACEs. And I love this idea of resilience. It's something we're working on diligently to impact and share. And in the research, the number one factor is a caring adult. And through today's webinar, we'll talk about how we can be that caring adult in a classroom context. And the second dimension is high expectations messaging, right? What are the children hearing from these caring adults? And the third dimension is that they are participants. They're making meaningful contributions to the process and taking ownership of what it means to be resilient. A wonderful quote from Robert Lifton says, "Resilience is our own human capacity to transform and change." And again, working with colleagues and defining resilience, we sort of have to have that agreement that that's what it is, and it's not a one specific thing or we can achieve, but it's how we continue to adapt and develop. And our role in supporting these young children that show up to our schools and are entrusted to our care, again, I want to emphasize that the research, specifically research done by Emmy Werner and Ruth Smith, have a wonderful quote about where we find ourselves as service provider. It says, essentially, our findings, both in America and Europe, that lifespan perspectives suggest that these buffers, us, the protective factors, make a more profound impact on life course of children who grow up under adverse conditions than do the specific risk factors or stressful life events. They appear to transcend ethnic, social class, geographical, and historical boundaries. And though we typically track ACEs scores through a metric or number, those are simply risk indicators. And it's important to note, it doesn't mean your story is written. So one's own ACE score, there is a correlative effect, but not a causal one. And that's what's so amazing about us as humans, is that we can transcend, and we do transcend. An additional sort of distinction I want to make as we move deeper into this is sometimes I find that teachers are seeking, and I want to make distinctions about the terms that we're going to be using. They're seeking de-escalation techniques, which are different than the trauma-informed approach that you see listed here, which is what we're going to be covering, is a way of doing things, and even distinct from a trauma-specific intervention. A trauma-specific intervention is designed specifically to address the consequences of a trauma and to facilitate healing. Examples, addiction and trauma recovery integration model, right? Something very specific there. And then in our third webinar, if you jump down to the fourth term there, trauma-informed care, is how we'll be looking at a systems shift with us as the doers, the ones that get to be the change. I do want to visit that term a little more deeply, this term de-escalation, because it's kind of what happens if we're remembering our biological reactions to stress and getting triggered. In the classroom context, we're really going to be trying to stay in the calm region, right? We're creating to facilitate safe environments. Things do happen, but we want to also support the children as they sort of escalate in that mountain. Unfortunately, in real time, teachers have very specific questions about what do I do when a child, and sometimes we use the term, has sort of been triggered or is operating from that limbic system, right? That freeze, flight, or flight dimension. And those are those de-escalation techniques. Psychological first aid is a wonderful program for you to go research and understand. But everything we're going to be kind of talking about is before the peak. So just to also kind of talk about that or put it into context.
And Brian, before we move forward, if you wouldn't mind just clarifying again the difference in the trauma-informed approach versus the trauma-informed care.
Great. So trauma-informed approach can be implemented in any type of service setting or organization. It's a way of being in relationship. And trauma-informed care is sort of a values-based position, and I'll kind of cover what they call the 4 R's of that at a systems level. Is that helpful?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Great. Okay, moving on. Thank you for chiming in, please. I do appreciate it. Lisa Ann, do you want to kind of open up with this here, and then I can talk about it a little bit more?
Yes, I'd love to. This is an area where I think our backgrounds are probably we have a so I can speak a lot to that behaviorism side. So having worked specifically with students who had behavior issues and having a background in applied behavior analysis, I was definitely that teacher who thought about things through like the ABCs, the antecedent, the behavior, the consequence. So always focusing on that, reducing those unwanted negative behaviors and finding, those reinforcers that were most meaningful to that child. And so I think that as I have learned more about ACEs and trauma, that has definitely probably taken me a little bit more into the area of your side, which I think you have that more of a humanism understanding and background.
Yes, yes. So also too, just a working understanding of behaviorism. Behaviorism sort of has its roots in Pavlov, B.F. Skinner, and really this sort of approach that external behaviors are those that can be observed, right? So more of a scientific approach to understanding human behavior, more of a stimulus and response kind of philosophy around that, and really kind of minimizing the mind in the investigation of it. And if we're talking about nature versus nurture, they're falling more onto the nurturing, the nurture, right? The context and the environment that we set being it. Versus the humanism, the more humanistic approach, which sort of emphasizes the study of the whole person, and that it's predicated on the belief that behavior is related to an individual's inner feelings and self-concept. Now, I too was, brought along in that sort of more behavioristic approach, consequences, and both need to occur for a well-balanced classroom. I think when we put this in the context of trauma, it's sort of more complicated because the externalized behaviors of a young person who's triggered or activated, there's very sort of behavioristic correlation to it. They feel threatened, they don't feel safe, they externalize the behavior. But our approach to solving, our approach to partnering, our approach to supporting is really influenced by a humanistic lens, that we need to kind of get to the root of the feelings, help them manage those emotions, and give them the techniques and ability to help. Now, I'll put a pin in this because this is more of a webinar 3, like systems, and there's a tension there, right? Things that we can measure, things that we can act on sort of exist in that data behavioristic phase. So we're actually challenging the paradigm of what is in our systems to move them to a more humanistic support system. And again, that's to be later. A good way, go ahead, sorry, Lisa,
Sorry, yeah, and just thinking as well as you're speaking, it just reminds me that, like, as an educator, we tend to, like, in the classroom, and I think I'm thinking about that the whole escalation and de-escalation graph slide that you just showed. We're constantly focusing on, oh, we see someone being triggered, we see agitation, we see these behaviors happening. And as humans, we do tend to focus on the negative a lot as well. And it's a challenge, like you said, that as an educator, we're looking to always teach skills we don't have. We're looking at students get more and more support and the classify, and that often occurs by us looking at negative attributes the majority of the time. So I know personally in some of the schools that I've worked at, it's just been a little bit harder to get started on the more humanistic side.
Great. And this is sort of the, for instance, of an example of what we want to do that sort of supports exactly what you said, right? What's going on with that child? Oh, they have ADHD. This is one thing, especially in the context where I was a teacher. Basically, I felt like every parent who had a child that was a 6th grader, which I was teaching, when they didn't listen, they'd sidebar me and go, is it because they have ADHD, right? We want to prescribe a problem so we can then fix it. And it gets complicated because the way behaviors present are not easily distinguished, and things co-locate, right? ADHD has a co-occurrence of a lot of other things, and what we see there is an example of how we need to be discerning, supportive, and curious. Approach the children with this friendly curiosity was a term that I heard about what's going on, right? So I think this is just sort of a nice concrete example of sometimes we can't punish the kids into compliance. Compliance doesn't mean engagement. It doesn't mean we've relieved them from the source of their pain, which is the reason for their externalized behavior. And I kind of like this just to remind ourselves that we need to pause and be curious and diligent in our investigation and work with the people and the teams, pulling resources so that we can best alleviate in the long term the cause of some of these problems. And the term trauma-informed approach, which you kind of asked for that clarification on, is typified by these components. As you see here, safety being number one, and that's engendered through trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment by way of voice and choice. They feel empowered as they're part of the process. And it also takes into consideration that we see the world through the lens that the world sees us, and that includes cultural, historical, and gender-related issues of how this young person shows up. And so I'm inviting this as a guiding principle to all you do within your classroom context and in your work, whatever that capacity is, after care, before care, right? All these touch points, this is sort of your framing of inquiry for self. Am I creating safety? Am I moving to trust? Is there peer support? So that's the sort of definition of trauma-informed approach. And I love this work that we're exploring within this idea of resilience, and that resilience shows up in a continuum, that we are all amazing. We have these ordinary superpowers, and that's surviving, right? Dealing with whatever you're dealing with, our bodies are hardwired for survival. If you want a really great read, The Body Keeps Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is like formative in understanding our behaviors, right? So what we do, how we encode it. Those kids who are dropping down into a protective pattern in a school context, there's not evaluation, it's what they learned, because 0 to 5, they grew up in a context that they needed to be hypervigilant, yet when they become a kindergartner and they're sitting on brightly colored squares with multiple peers, and they're being asked for the first time to sort of attend to a single object of information, the teacher, their hypervigilance sort of presents in the wrong way. It's not a evaluation, it's just the context has shifted for the skills that they bring. So that's kind of that survival and understanding. And then for us as providers, the ability to sort of center, to ground, to be present is essential. And we need to not only practice that, we need to model it with the children and give them opportunities to find that centering, which allows then this progression to connecting and then collaborating at the macro level. And I'll explore that sort of last slide, that clamshell there. Survival is already under it, and we try to provide some dimensionality, this idea that we're both centering with self and centering with group at the same time, and we kind of move in and out of those freely. Lisa Ann?
Yeah, I just connect much because I feel this in just my understanding of children and of adults when we think about the impact of trauma on them, both in the cognitive impacts and the impacts in their SEL skills. And so when we think of an educator coming in, we're thinking, okay, developmentally, you know, what did we miss? Where are we on that on this kind of continuum of we still learning how to center ourselves, which, you know, just like children, that's where they start first. They start learning these skills in their own self, you know, their egotistical self, and then they learn how to apply these skills and connecting with others. And we see that in like the developments of the types of play, and then of course moving into collaborating. And when we think of educators who've got impacts on their own self coming into a classroom and having to maintain this with all those various individuals, it just makes it, the visual here just really help out these concentric circles of the educator with each child, where they're at. So that's something that I think we're able to act on here, and just understanding that every individual is different and where they are on the path is different. And so it does really help to know a child well, and to having that trust, and is going to really like ground this whole journey.
Great, thank you. And sort of from a primary perspective, I really like to interpret the word safety, especially in the school context, around the relationships that are there, because kids get triggered in a classroom. Often anecdotally, right, teachers know that kids are sort of getting triggered, and it's about relationships, either relationship with the teacher or relationships with their peers. And perhaps a fear of physical violence, we don't know, but how are you creating a container that holds safety as its main function, and connecting these kids through your ability to control the environment? In graduate school, if I didn't mention, I went to UC Santa Cruz for graduate school, and we really talked about, I had a great conversation with one of my professors about, teachers sometimes could be conceptualized as, I loved the control in the classroom. I love being able to create a world for a child. And I want to leverage that intention that many of the educators I work with appreciate, is that ability to be for the children what they were hoping for. And this sort of Happy Child Summit quote was great, because he was challenging the notion that to know good is to do good, right? We actually have to put in structures, and reminders, repetitions, and rituals are actually the things that will keep us coming back together to maintain that centering as a group together. And making sure we have practices in circle time and restorative time that really allow us to check through those boxes of peer support, transparency, etc. And when we're able to see people differently, we behave differently, right? And our interpretation that, instead of what's wrong with her, what's wrong with my friend, what's wrong with this other person, what's wrong with this student, we start to get under it and say, what happened? How can I help? And so it's empathy that begins to transform and connect us, and connect that group together. So asking yourself, where and how do you have those reminders, repetition, and rituals within your classroom?
When you were starting to speak about, when we see people differently, this is another area where I think we really connect as organizations. And through our work in supporting districts, we really have been able to help educators see children differently, to really know what their strengths are, so that when they're thinking about building this environment of trust, that they can provide opportunities for children that are going to be successful. So it's a safe zone where they feel successful, and where those networks and communities and relationships are being built. And so we really look at, the strengths of a child, and in the area of their social emotional learning skills. And so uniquely, that is something that the DESA does, and we're focusing on that optimistic thinking as well, and really on our research base of resiliency from which we're built. We're still striving to not only provide that for students, but to also address educators' SEL in the same framework, and really be able to increase that awareness, increase those that foundational knowledge, and have educators start that journey with themselves as they continue to support their students in the classroom. And
Great.
so this little visual here just kind of gives an idea of all the different kind of skill areas that there are, but that there are a lot of these skills that are actually those protective factors that can be built within a child themselves, in addition to that safety and nurturing environment can provide.
Thank you. And I'm going to kind of pick up the pace here, be respectful of time. I know that we'll plan to stay on and answer questions. Um, and these are those concrete skills. The Strength Switch by Dr. Leah Waters. She has a wonderful quote. You know, we mistakenly believe that to make children stronger, we have to sort of backfill these deficits, but rather leading children to their own innate strengths and ability to help them stay calm when they're triggered, to notice that agitation and acceleration. These are some of those concrete skills that we hope that centering in our lexicon talks about noticing and breathing. Breathing is so pervasive, this mindfulness awareness, because in that trauma theory, our breathing patterns are both autonomic and something we can control. So sometimes we have things working in our back brain, you know, how our mom dropped us off, who's going to pick us up that day. We're actually in a state of stress that we're not aware of. So our breathing patterns get tighter. But how are you inviting the children to be conscious and aware that they are safe? And breathing is a great way to actually override some of those autonomic systems to activate the parasympathetic system to bring us into regulation. That's a wonderful list that I'll be happy to explain more at another time. Lisa Ann, did you want to offer any thoughts on this idea about how are you doing mindfulness, these practices in your classroom? All right.
Sorry again.
Oh, it's mute.
Phone. It's cutting in and out. I really found that even in small amounts of time, that building these practices into the classroom routine was very helpful. It was it made a noticeable difference. So not only looking at mindfulness, but there's lots of programs for children's yoga and different activities that can be short and sweet and give them a moment to learn how to do something in a different way that they can then lean on later on. And so this is one, and developmentally, this is something that is one of the best places to start. Self-awareness, self-awareness, personal responsibility, and optimistic thinking. They all are those very intrapersonal skill sets. And so continuing to build on those is something that can really meet the needs of students who have trauma, but also provide skills for students to continue building their resilience in case, things that do come in life, cross their path.
Great. And part of why I brought this, and I love that you're punctuating that our presence, what we do as educators, is picked up on by the children. So if we see someone going somewhere, they're getting agitated, I mirror that agitation. We both accelerate. Now we're at the tippy top. We're both sort of triggered. And the centering is breathing and bringing oneself to center. And that co-regulation, Heart Math Institute has some wonderful things about mirroring and congruency of energies and body physiology, that when we presence ourselves in our calm, so will be the kids. And I have to say a big shout out to Howard Yank of Portland State. He and I were in this wonderful discussion about power dynamics and how sometimes for certain teachers, this is a growth edge about what their role is in a given situation. And we're starting to understand that it's not our job to take away the pain of people, right? It kind of sometimes adds to the tension. And it's our ability to be present and allow them to do the hard work, build the relationship, stabilize, and then offer solutions and direct them towards care. As I mentioned, this relational language is a great framework, DEI, to sort of allow you to enter into a conversation, not trying to solve it, and then work kind of side by side with them in a relational way that sort of takes out some of the power dynamics. You need to do this or this, right? So I just thought there's such a concrete, wonderful thing. And again, shout out to Howard Yank there. And then ultimately, this awareness that within this classroom context, we want each classroom to sort of be a microcosm of the school climate as a whole, that we see is our largest goal, right? Because none of these things are happening independently, yet in each classroom, we work from the inside out, scaffolding the self, the centering, but we're always constantly moving through each of these skill sets. And again, just kind of checking out the timeline. There's so much to explore here. And I'm assuming that there's some questions, and I didn't know, Lisa Ann, if there's anything on this slide you kind of wanted to wrap up with before we turn it back to Megan.
No, just that I think that we're both definitely on the mission of providing opportunities and support, and really increasing the awareness of what these skill sets are, and how we can continue to integrate them into our systems, and to have an enlarged opportunity and vision and focus about who and how that can happen. Great. And I'm having just some technical issues. So I'm trying to work through that too.
Right. We get it. So thank you. Megan.
All right. It looks like we have a couple of questions. If you are listening and you would like to pop your question into the Q&A box, I would suggest that you do that right now so that we can go ahead and answer some of these. The first question that we have is, can you give an example of a meaningful contribution? And I believe this was back at the beginning.
It's one of the 3 dimensions of resilience. Yeah, no. So one, being caring adult. You are that caring adult when you inquire and lean into the conversation. You let them know that they can find a way. But a meaningful contribution would be sort of a strength-based option. Do you want to use your words? How can I help you? They have to have some kind of agency in the process, right? It's not for us to do. We don't do things to or for the child. We do them with them. And so the meaningful contribution dimension is really their agency. How are they going to be able to show up to be a part of that problem solve? And so we can't just hand them a playbook. They have to sort of adopt it, internalize it, because the ultimate goal for us as educators is to make ourselves progressively unnecessary, right? As a parent, it's a tricky thing that my value and my success is that you don't need me in that zone of proximal development, right? So until they start making contributions towards it, they will never have and build those capacities to then therefore deal with it on their own. So it's just sort of a reminder that it's something for them to execute and do.
Great. Let's see. There was another question that someone asked at the very beginning of the webinar. They said they would love to know who the source of the quote is on the very first slide that says, children have impeccable reasons for behaving exactly as they do.
Oh, super proud to say that is our executive director, Dr. Charles Fisher, over at Dovetail Learning. And I don't think I put quotes because both of those quotes on that slide are from our organization. And perhaps it was in the first one where I quoted him. I always love to give him the credit where credit is due, but it's a wonderful summative statement when we think about how the kids arrive in our classroom, right? There's a reason, and we need to be curious about that.
That's great. Another question we had, are these strategies age specific? Meaning, do they pertain to primary and secondary aged students?
And I'm assuming it's the centering skills. I guess my answer to that is that there is always a developmental variation for each of the skills, and some of them, depending on where they are developmentally, are going to be more difficult. Lisa Ann and I were talking on earlier is because of kids operating from that more egocentric perspective, it's harder for them to even, and they're unable to actually perceive the perspective of another. So connecting is harder in certain areas, but they can start to learn those concrete skills. And so, I hate to sound like an educator, when we spiral these skills up, a concept like patience, patience has a very different definition for a child when they're in first grade as even that same child when they're in sixth grade. So we're not moving towards mastery in any of these types of domains, because this is that human development work, things that I need to work in as a parent and father. My version of patience is totally different than what it was. So sort of feels almost like a political answer. I didn't kind of give it. Yes, there's context specific things that can help kids at each stage, but their interpretation and application grows just as they do.
Mm. We also had an excellent question. Joy asks, why is this called, and she puts in quotations, trauma informed practice?
Ooh, now you're just questioning the whole lexicon, right? That stuff I pulled from SAMHSA, right? Substance Abuse and Health Administration. And I even love the question because we dance between the terms childhood, adverse childhood experience, adversity, right? But adversity itself is just the state of a serious or continued difficulty or misfortune. We pivot then the definition of the word trauma in terms that denote the inability of an individual or community to respond in a healthy way to acute or chronic stress. And in the ACEs study, I think it's important to note that the ACEs score is your adversity score. It is a way to look at the landscape, but it doesn't necessarily make it a trauma. One traumatic event, an adversity, could become a trauma. So I think we're just really expanding our awareness about things. So I think that's a great question. It's just an inherited language for these protocols that are emerging.
Excellent. And then, of course, we have a lot of questions about the recording and the resources. So just as a reminder, if you weren't on at the beginning of the webinar, we will be sending an email to all of the people who registered with a link to the recording, a link that will take you to a form where you can receive your certificate. And we will also be including some of the resources that we talked about today. So don't worry, you will get all of that in an email, most likely tomorrow morning from me. So with that, we looks like we don't have any other questions about trauma specifically. Oh, here's one more, really quickly. Where can we get an ACE score, or how do we get one?
Oh, great. This might be in the follow-up of the initial resources. There's resources on ACEs Aware out here in California. There's a lot of different types, and people add various dimensions to it, but ACEs Aware is one that I know has a existing PDF de-identified too if you want it. So yeah, ACEs Aware.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. And I believe that is it. If we do have additional questions that we weren't able to get to, we will make sure that we get those questions to the presenters so that we can answer them in a follow-up email. Once again, my name is Megan with Aperture Education. Thank you so much to Lisa Ann and Brian for the excellent presentation today. You will receive an email from me tomorrow with a link to receive your certificate, a link to the recording, a link to all of the slides that were shared today, and those supplemental resources. So again, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and we hope to see you on February 6th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great evening.